Okay, so fresh off of Alex Pereira v Magomed Ankalaev 2, where we saw Pereira run through Ankalaev in basically a minute and a half to regain the UFC light heavyweight championship, there's now been talks of Khamzat fighting Alex Pereira next. Now, could this fight actually happen? I can't speak to that. There's been reports out there. Dana doesn't seem to be particularly keen on it, but I want to tell you why this fight should happen, right? This fight should happen because, and honestly, it should happen at heavyweight. I'm gonna preface this. This fight should be at heavyweight. I think Khamzat would weigh in at probably 210, 215, and Pereira would be, 240 at least, right? Probably about 240. And just because this fight is a non-title fight doesn't make it any less of a big fight. Right? A world title at this point from the UFC, it really doesn't make this fight any bigger than it already is. Right? And in the pay-per-view model, although the example I'm going to give is in boxing, it does show just because it's a world title fight doesn't guarantee pay-per-view sales. And just because it's a non-title fight doesn't mean it can't do well in the pay-per-view market, right? The example I want to give is Tank versus Ryan Garcia. Now, as far as I know, this wasn't a fight that had any world titles on the line. Yet, this did over 1 million, I think it did 1.2 million pay-per-view sales. Right? Because of two gigantic names in the sport. Two of the biggest names at those weight divisions going at it. Right? Ryan Garcia was a huge social media star at that point. And Tank was, one of the leading pay-per-view stars in boxing. And still is to this day. I think ultimately, like I said, that was a huge fight for both guys. Both guys got seriously paid from that. And then, to compare that to a world title fight that didn't have the same amount of fanfare would be like a Devin Haney versus Lomachenko for the undisputed lightweight title. Same weight division. Right, same weight division, but nowhere near the same fanfare. And I believe that fight did about 140k pay-per-view buys. Compared to Tank and Ryan Garcia doing over 1 million with no world titles. And Haney v Lomachenko had 4 world titles on the line. Right, so I think both guys currently at each respective weight class has a clear number one contender. So for me, I think that clear number one contender should be Oldberg for Pereira at light heavyweight because Yuri's been stopped twice badly by Pereira. Like, he doesn't need to be having that trilogy fight. So I would be leaning Oldberg for Pereira. And then I think at middleweight it's clear that Imavov is going to be getting the next title shot. I don't think that's controversial or, I think that's a pretty obvious decision. But yeah, I think both guys should get through those opponents as well. I think Pereira's far better on the feet than Oldberg. Even though Oldberg's got a sneaky game, and I didn't talk about Oldberg's win against Dominic Reyes, I might make a video about that. But, yeah, a sneaky game, but Pereira should be too advanced on the feet, even though Oldberg's, a serious kickboxer. And like we've seen in his fights, don't underestimate his striking game at all and his power. But yeah, assuming Pereira can get through that, then at middleweight with Khamzat, you've got him v Imavov. I think Imavov definitely poses some more questions than what Oldberg does to Pereira because Imavov can seriously wrestle, and he's got power in those hands, and physically he won't be dwarfed by Khamzat. Whereas a lot of Khamzat's opponents, he's physically dwarfed them, except for, literally his most recent fight, and to be fair, his most dominant against Dricus du Plessis. Whereas Khamzat always has the physicality advantage over his opponent. He didn't necessarily have that against DDP in terms of raw weight. In terms of grappling technique, that was abundantly clear. That was made abundantly clear to us very early on. But yeah, Imavov does pose some more questions, but assuming both guys can get through those respective number one contender fights, then there is no reason why we can't be seeing this fight at heavyweight on a UFC pay-per-view card. This could headline a pay-per-view easily. Could easily headline a pay-per-view. And would likely be probably the best pay-per-view of the UFC's calendar year in terms of financial and commercial success. Because there's not really any other super fights that you could make that would, really do those sort of numbers, and unless maybe like an Islam v Khamzat. Again, that's involving Khamzat. Yeah, I really don't know. I don't think there is any. I mean, Marab v Pantoja isn't a crazy super fight in terms of commercial appeal. In terms of, technical quality, like definitely is a fight that makes sense for both guys. But would the UFC make that with... Because I know UFC, they seem to hate super fights. Whereas in boxing, you see guys moving up in weight all the time. Moving up in weight, moving up more than one weight division, even moving down. It's very different in boxing to UFC. And that's one thing that I hope Dana White doesn't sort of affect. He doesn't just make it it's like, guys, only want to stay in one weight division. Whereas, you would never get a guy like Stephen Fulton in the UFC. One, because Stephen Fulton is, I believe, currently a 2-weight world champion that's going to be fighting for his 3rd world championship in a 3rd weight division. That's right, he was champion at super bantamweight, featherweight, and is now moving up to super featherweight. But because MMA has, fewer divisions and a bigger gap between each division, you're not going to see a 3-weight world champion, like, unless you are absolutely generational, which, there is something to be said for that. There is something to be said for that, but in my opinion, I like the way it is in boxing. Loads of weight classes, loads of world champions. I love that, right? But yeah, overall, I think Pereira v Khamzat should happen. It should happen after each guy's fought their number one contender, because I really don't see much else in those divisions other than those, like I said, immediate number one contenders. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting fight. I think I'm not even going to give a prediction on how I think that fight would go. I'm not even going to do that, but I think this fight should get made. If the fight does get made, then I'll give a tactical breakdown, or maybe another point, or if you guys really want me to, I can give a tactical breakdown of this video on what I think on this fight and what I think actually would happen. But yeah, immediately, let me know what you guys think. Do you think Khamzat, and the Pereira should happen? Or do you think it won't happen? I'd be curious to know what you guys think in the comments below. And yeah, another episode of the Seth Solo Side Quest in the bag, and I'm out. Peace.